From Self-Pub to Orbit, The Lost War left me with many questions. Chief among them, how many zombies are too many zombies? Welcome back to the Pop Docs channel. My name is Joseph. I am one half of the Pop Docs, back with another book review. In this video, I will be giving my thoughts on The Lost War by Justin Lee Anderson. This is book one in the Ideen saga. And with that first attempt at pronouncing one of the many terms, names, titles in this particular book, I want to offer a disclaimer at the outset that if I mispronounce any of these words in this video, I apologize far in advance. But one of the reasons I picked up The Lost War in the first place was because I wanted to start a series at its outset. That is, get in on the ground floor of a new series in the fantasy genre. And this book offered that opportunity. As I mentioned, this is book one of the Ideen saga. As I understand it, Justin Lee Anderson is working on book two of this particular series. And so in this video, I'll briefly offer a synopsis of this story in a non-spoiler way. I'll then talk about some of the things I liked about this story, some of the criticisms I had about this particular book, and then I do want to have a segment that delves into some spoilers, because I think really talking through some of the elements in a spoilery fashion will really provide the evidentiary foundation for some of my criticisms of this particular book. And then I'll conclude this video with my rating of the book and whether or not I would recommend it to those interested in the fantasy genre. So, what is The Lost War about? Well, I was thinking about how best to describe this beyond just going through a general synopsis of this story or the general plot line of this story. One of the best ways I could come up with was to think about this particular story as a collection or a concoction of fantasy archetypes, fantasy tropes, two types of zombies, two different zombie-like creatures in this story. There are demons in this story. There are attempts to cross-pollinate zombies with demons in this story. There is a magic system that is multifaceted, but also very familiar. And so this also relates back, in my view, in large part to those fantasy archetypes, which is really the expression of each of these characters. You can definitely fit each of the main characters in this particular story into these fantasy archetypes, and then also certainly related to some of the fantasy tropes that will be very familiar to avid readers, longtime readers of books and stories in the fantasy genre. But what is ultimately going on in this particular story? Well, this story begins not with an exciting event, but with an inciting meeting. There is a council that is formed by the newly crowned king of Ideen, King Janaeus, and he is putting together a council of advisors, one of whom is a Dryad, which is the term for the magic users in this particular world. This is one of the main characters, Aronach, that we're going to follow throughout this book. He is accompanied by Alondria, who is his bodyguard. However, there seems to be something more than a business relationship between Aronach and Alondria. We have Nyria, who is going to oversee the navy of this kingdom. There's Glorbad, who is going to oversee the armed forces, the land forces of this particular kingdom. They're going to meet two others, one of whom is supposed to be on the council. That is Mariston, who is the leader of this monastic order that is also affiliated with this order of knights who are trained to fight demons. And we meet one of them in particular that we focus on and spend time with in this story, whose name is Samily. And so ultimately, all of these characters are tasked by the new king to go and find a deposed or exiled queen and escort her back to her kingdom, where she can then retake her throne and then hopefully become an ally of Ideen. I keep referencing Janaeus as a new king. Well, that's because there is an indication that Ideen, this country, is coming out of two different wars. The first being a rebellion against Hafnag, the previous king. And the rebellion was led by Janaeus and Aronach working together. Subsequent to that, I believe, if I understand the timeline of the events in this story, the new kingdom is challenged by a Dread who can wield the powers of necromancy and demonology, something that is rare, if not impossible, in this world, in the sense that this Dread can combine two different schools of magic. Generally speaking, the Dryads, the magic users in this world, can only control one type of magic, one school of magic. And so that's why this particular Dryad, whose name is Mynagog, is rare and very dangerous, and ultimately raises an army of demons and undead to challenge the rule of the new King Janaeus and his allies. They ultimately essentially imprison Mynagog in this castle, and the prison is surrounded by the dead and demons. And so that is one of the reasons why King Janaeus and his allies are unable to try and ultimately defeat Mynagog, because he has been trapped and surrounded by his minions. And so that's the very general setup of this particular story. This collection of heroes goes out on this journey to try and find and escort this exiled queen back to her kingdom to regain their throne and ultimately become an ally of Ideen and offer Ideen assistance in the continuing war against Mynagog, but also in trying to help this kingdom rebuild from this period of civil war, as well as this encounter or this war with Mynagog. That's the non-spoiler overview of The Lost War. In a similar fashion, that is, in a non-spoiler way, what did I like about this particular book? I really did enjoy the interactions between the characters, particularly the interactions between Aronach and Alandria, the interactions between Glorbad and Vastin. Vastin is this blacksmith that Aronach befriends at the outset of the novel, and then ultimately recruits Vastin to join this cadre, this group, on their quest to find this queen, to provide blacksmithing services, essentially. Glorbad, throughout this book, is working with Vastin to help train Vastin in the martial arts, essentially the ability to use an axe, which is Vastin's chosen weapon. And their interplay, the mentor-mentee relationship between Glorbad and Vastin, I thought was one of the highlights of this particular story. I also liked Nyria's interaction with everyone. Nyria was one of my favorite characters ultimately by the end of this story. And so anytime she was interacting with any of the different characters in the group, I really enjoyed reading those particular scenes. This is a little bit of foreshadowing, but one of my criticisms of this particular story is that while I really enjoyed the interactions between or among these different characters, I really did think individually there wasn't a whole lot of depth to each of these characters. And so individually, I thought there was a lot of room that Mr. Anderson could have expanded upon for each of these characters. And so where they shine is in these interactions, but where that shine starts to dim is when we really spend some time with each individual character. And I'll get a little more into that, provide an example of that critique in the spoiler section of this particular video. I also thought that the action was quite good. There are, as the rundown suggests, different types of adversaries that our group encounters throughout this book. Different types of zombies, demons, human antagonists. And each type of encounter presents unique challenges to our heroes, our protagonists in this story. And I thought Mr. Anderson did a good job really trying to make each kind of encounter its own thing, its own unique encounter, its unique fight. And the descriptions of the fights were quite good. I quite enjoyed reading the action sequences in this particular story. Finally, I really think it does a good job setting up mysteries that presumably will be addressed in future installments in the Ideen saga. And so upon finishing this particular book, I was really left wanting to know more about this world, about these characters. And so another form of foreshadowing here, ultimately, I think despite the criticisms that I'm going to get into here in a few moments, I do think this book did what first books in series need to do, which is create circumstances where readers want to come back for the sequels. And ultimately, I think there is enough here that readers will want to continue to follow the exploits of these particular characters to see this world more fleshed out. But we'll get into that at the tail end of this video when I get into my recommendation for this particular book. Sticking with non-spoilers, what were some of the criticisms or critiques I had of The Lost War? The first one I mentioned, talked a little bit about, was that I think individually the characters that we follow lacked depth. I thought there was something missing from a lot of the POV chapters, and that we really didn't, as readers, get to know each of these protagonists as much as we should and would want to. I was really left with wanting more in terms of the character development of each of the protagonists in this particular story. Despite the fact, as I mentioned, their interactions with one another were good. And in fact, I think most of the character work that's done in this particular story is through these interactions. I just think it needed to be built up more individually, particularly when we jump into the heads of each of these protagonists that headline the POV elements of the different chapters and the different parts of chapters in this story. Because one of the other criticisms I had with The Lost War is sometimes it was difficult to follow in a given chapter who was the POV character. Part of that's because I don't think we get enough of their own perceptions as characters while we're with them as the point of view character in a particular chapter. The second reason I found it somewhat difficult to follow these particular POVs in these chapters is because there would be multiple POVs in a given chapter. And I think in sequels, the storytelling would be improved if each chapter was headlined by a specific character, rather than breaking up chapters into different characters and then kind of merging them into one particular chapter. And because taken together, I sometimes had to reread a couple initial paragraphs in each section of each chapter to figure out whose mind, perspective, point of view I'm following in this particular part of the chapter. I hesitate to get too in-depth until the spoiler section with this particular critique, but there is a storytelling device that putatively is employed to try to raise tensions, create anxiety, establish stakes in the story that is swiftly undercut by this particular storytelling device. And to try to remain as obtuse or obscure or non-spoilers I can, I'm going to leave it there, and I'll get more into that in the spoiler section, because I think that was one of the significant shortcomings of this particular story, is this storytelling device. I don't know if I've ever heard anyone praise or enjoy reading in their stories, seen in television or in film. But we'll get more into that in the spoiler section. The last thing I wanted to talk about in this particular section of the video is I don't think there's enough appreciation for time and space in this particular story. This book does have a map to give readers some sense of where we are in this particular world, where we're going to go throughout the story, different landmarks, different points of interest along the way, along the journey of these characters. However, in the actual narrative, it does get to a point where the characters start to feel like they're just teleporting around this area, that there isn't much distance between places, and that it doesn't take a whole lot of time to move about this particular country. But when you look in the map, it does seem to be a fairly large area. And so ultimately, I think a lot of this story devolves into that teleportation problem for its characters. And I don't want to be too critical on this point, because I think writing in such a way to convey time and space in fantasy novels in particular is incredibly difficult. And so it did take me out a little bit of the story, but I don't think it was significant enough to keep me from necessarily jumping back into future installments here. But I think that's another area where Mr. Anderson could improve in future installments, is really building in a better sense of time and space, and to try to reduce that feeling that these characters are teleporting around this particular world. That concludes my non-spoiler thoughts on The Lost War. And so I want to spend a few moments here jumping into and talking in a spoiler fashion about The Lost War and try to expand a little bit on my non-spoiler thoughts, particularly the criticisms I had for The Lost War. And the first thing, which I think is the significant thing, is fake deaths. And this is the storytelling device that attempts to raise stakes in the story, but really is undercutting any stakes that stories have. This book is absolutely filled with fake deaths. For example, Maristan and Vastim seemingly become one of the two types of zombies in this story. But we later find out that it's a curse, and curses are reversible. And so although some of the zombies that have been cursed in this way are beyond help because they ultimately are not taking in any nutrients, nourishment, and so they are decaying away. And so some of the zombies cannot be saved. But if you were turned fairly recently and the curse can then be reversed, you can survive this zombification. And so Maristan and Vastim fall into this particular category. And so ultimately, Maristan, we get back into the story partway through. Vastim is being kept alive in zombie form because of the mortal wound, or the seemingly mortal wound that he suffered. Another fake death on a fake death. It's like a fake death inception for Vastim. But essentially, there is a way to get Vastim back. There is the dinner among Aranok, Elandria, Samali, and Weir, where Weir poisons all three of them, Aranok, Elandria, and Samali. But Samali, it turns out, is a Dreyad with the ability to reverse time to different degrees. And using this ability, she saves all three of them. And they're able to overcome that particular obstacle in their journey, and they go forward. We don't see it, but at the end, when the three of them are battling this demon, trying to get to Minagog, she tells them after the battle that they died several times, and that she used her time powers to revive all of them so they can then try to formulate a new way to take down the beast. This is very Edge of Tomorrow type of mechanism here, which is a good movie, parenthetically. I would definitely recommend it. It's a fun action film. Nevertheless, just another example of fake deaths in this particular story. The last example I wanted to use was when Glorbad, Nyria, and Maristan are fighting a demon in the location where the Exile Queen is supposedly holed up. And in that altercation, Glorbad is killed. Nyria seemingly, again, is mortally wounded. She thinks Maristan is mortally wounded and killed. Of course, we find out that Maristan actually slayed the demon and was able to take Nyria back to this school. Again, this is another issue with the inability to really understand where these people are in this world, and not enough of an appreciation for time and space, because Maristan's able to take someone who he sounds like is mortally wounded from this particular location back to another location where she can be healed. So I don't think Glorbad's dead either. I just think this fake death mechanism was used way too much. For me personally, one time is usually too much. Whether that's a novel, a television show, or a film. And so I really think that's the biggest thing that detracts from this particular story. And I hope it's something that's left to the side in future installments. Another element kind of the writing style was there was a character, I've checked my notes, Dargan Argyle, who has a couple POV sections at the outside of this book, disappears for hundreds of pages, and then reappears in the epilogue, missing legs. And certainly this is a setup, presumably, for at least the sequel. Somewhat intriguing setup, given the different circumstances surrounding it. But it was very strange to introduce this character, spend some time with this character, and then the character just ghosts the reader for the rest of the book, only to pop up at the very end. And because there's no context throughout the rest of the story for this character, it's not very meaningful, ultimately, when they pop back up, and given their circumstances. And so I think the story would have been better if this character wasn't in it at all, or if there was some more time spent to try to provide a little context for what's happening to this particular character by the end of the story. The ending was very interesting. It's basically an exposition dump of everything that's happened in the story. Aronach and Alondria and Samily sit down with Minagog, who turns out is actually an ally and friend of our main characters. And it turns out Janaeus was the villain the whole time. Janaeus is a Dreyad with the capacity to alter memories, to impose certain memories, very Inception-like again. And Janaeus has secured some artifact that expands his powers. And so he's essentially, purportedly, it seems like, a lot of it's not clear, despite all the exposition that is dumped in the last several pages about what happened. But it did feel kind of wasteful for the story, because we have this whole narrative for several hundreds of pages. We're under the impression that certain characters are who they are, and that our characters are going on this quest to achieve this goal. And it turns out that's all wrong. And so if you really want to know what's going on, all you really have to do is read the last couple chapters after Aronach and Minagog have their clash. And Aronach's memory is restored. And so I thought that it kind of was a way to end the story that lacked energy, if that makes sense. Hopefully it makes sense. I just thought it was a weird way to end the story. It's kind of an interesting conceit as well to the whole story, to basically affirm at the end that everything you've read is not reality, even though the events are occurring. And the reason I say affirm is because I think foreshadowing in this particular book is very heavy-handed. It was obvious to me as I was reading through this that something had happened to their memories, because there are several references in different ways throughout this story to memory loss, to manipulated memories, to manufactured memories. And the foreshadowing was not subtle at all. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it led to a feeling of tedium at certain points where I just was hoping that they would get to the ultimate reveal of what was going on with the memories of these characters, because it was so obvious, in my view, of what was going on. And ultimately kind of the twist. And because I thought the foreshadowing was so heavy-handed, it wasn't a twist as I was reading through as I got to the end. And so I think that's something potentially that Mr. Anderson could also improve upon in subsequent installments of this particular series and other stories that he writes, is to make the foreshadowing a little more subtle, so that readers have to be a little more careful about what's going on, to try and figure out or find these puzzle pieces and then figure out and put them together, to also secure the shock value of the twist. The last thing I want to mention in this particular segment is I had referenced how I think individually there wasn't a lot of depth into the characters. And this is, I think, one of the character elements that is lacking in this story. And an example of that is Samily, who is very devout to God in this story. Capital G, God. And she thinks that her Dreyad powers are actually a gift from God, and they're healing powers. They're not Dreyad powers. They don't have anything to do with time, that she's actually healing characters in this particular story. When she finds out that actually she's a Dreyad, and she's just rewinding time as opposed to healing individuals, this, I think, is supposed to plunge her into a crisis of faith. And there's one scene, I believe, with Aronach, where they're talking about God and what it means for her to be a Dreyad and what that means for her faith. And so there's at least one scene where there's an attempt to try to depict this crisis of faith, but it's only one scene, and it's very surface level, I felt, reading it, because it turns into a debate between someone of faith and Aronach, as I mentioned, I believe it's Aronach, who essentially is either an agnostic or an atheist, person not of faith, rather than really a character moment for Samily in particular. And this is just one example, I think, in the story of the lack of character depth that we see emerge throughout this story. So hopefully that's another thing in the subsequent installments of the saga, that we get a little more individual character growth that comes from being with these individuals, going on the journey with them, seeing things through their own perspective, their own points of view, rather than solely through the interactions they have with one another. Although, as I mentioned, I did like the interactions, generally speaking, between the characters in this story. Having said all that, Admittedly, I focused more on the criticisms I've had of this story than the things I liked in the story. Although, as this video hopefully has shown, I did enjoy several elements of this story. Taken together, out of 10, I would give this a 5.5. However, as I alluded to, I did think Mr. Anderson set up some intriguing mysteries, some intriguing elements in this particular entry, this initial entry into the Ideen saga. And so I am actually going to stick with this saga. I am going to read at least one more entry in the Ideen saga to see where this story is going, because I am intrigued ultimately. And so although it's a low rating and I have all these criticisms, I am still looking forward to the next entry in the Ideen saga, the next story that Mr. Anderson writes. Will it be at the top of my reading list? Probably not. But I will make sure to carve out time when the second book debuts to sit down and jump back into this world, back into the saga, to see where these characters are going next. If you've read The Lost War, do you agree with the points that I made? However, have you disagreed with some of the points I made about The Lost War? Either way, please jump into the comments below. Join the conversation surrounding this story, and also let me know that if you haven't heard about it or haven't read it, are you planning to pick up The Lost War and dive into the world of Ideen? Also, if you like book reviews, if you like podcasts about science fiction fantasy in all different types of media, please hit the subscribe button on our channel. We are the Pop Docs, and we talk about fantasy and science fiction in books, in television, in film, and in conventions. So, with that, the Pop Docs Clinic, for now, is officially closed.